Even at 1,000 feet above the financial city, it's difficult to imagine that London started here, stretched between two hills. On one stands the NatWest Tower, now Tower 42, and on the other, St Paul's Cathedral. The Romans chose this site partially because of the hills, and partially because modern-day Southwark was a series of sandy islands which made it easy for them to throw a bridge across the river. From the air, London seems to shrink in size and landmarks appear closer together. Great patterns are clearly visible, the streets, squares and areas of green. Although so much has changed over the centuries, it's still possible to find the evidence of how London has developed from the Roman occupation nearly 2,000 years ago. The Roman town was surrounded by 20-foot-high stone walls, small stretches of which still survive today. It never really outgrew them, although in the surrounding countryside there were villas and farms. In the late 4th century, after the Roman administration was withdrawn, the city was gradually abandoned, and when the next major settlement grew up, it was upstream at Aldwych. Aldwych simply means Old Port, and was where the Saxons had their city, right here on the site of the Opera House. Viking raids decimated this settlement, and so in the 880s, Alfred the Great moved the town back inside the old Roman walls. These streets, like Bow Lane, running down to the waterside, were laid out by King Alfred, who can claim to be the founder of modern London. Right through the Middle Ages, the city grew within the Roman walls. There are few signs of medieval London now, but remarkably the street patterns and names are those that its medieval inhabitants would have known, including Cornhill, Poultry, Milk Street and Cheapside. The odd medieval church survives, such as St Bartholomew the Great in Smithfield, and of course, just outside the city, on its eastern edge, was the great royal fortress of the Tower. A single great merchant's house survives, built by Sir John Crosby in Bishopsgate. It was rescued in the 1920s and moved to Chelsea. It is now set in a modern recreation of a great Tudor merchant's house and gives us a glimpse of how the medieval millionaires of London once lived. Downriver from the city, on an island more or less beneath the Houses of Parliament, another settlement was growing up. Kings of England had, by the 13th century, decided to make their principal residence in Westminster, where a great palace rose on the banks of the River Thames. Westminster Hall is more or less the only survivor of this complex that was, in its day, the largest palace in England. Next door was the Royal Church and Mausoleum, Westminster Abbey. So, already by the 13th century, the familiar picture that we know today was already established. There was London, the centre of trade and finance, and Westminster, the centre of government and royalty. Two parts were soon to join up. As it became more important to be close to the king and his court, the great nobles and bishops began to build their palaces closer to Westminster. The Strand, literally meaning the water's edge, became the smartest address in London. Somerset House started life as one of these great mansions, although it was rebuilt in its present form in 1775. In the Tudor period, apart from a very small number of royal and noble houses, London was built of timber. Most were destroyed in the Great Fire of London, but a small number of heavily restored Tudor buildings survived to give us an impression of Henry VIII's London, like here, in Chancery Lane. Henry VIII, of course, also dissolved the monasteries at the Reformation, causing a massive transfer of land from church to private hands. This is Charterhouse, that the king took for himself to store hunting equipment in. But generally, little survives of the great monastic institutions that dominated medieval London. Apart, that is, from the odd survival, like the Gatehouse of St John in Clerkenwell, or names, like Blackfriars and Cannon Street. When James I came to the throne in 1603, he announced that although he'd found a city of timber, he wanted to leave it one of brick and stone. The only real space standing today reflecting this ambition is Covent Garden, where Francis Russell, the Earl of Bedford, laid out London's first square, designed by the architect Inigo Jones and inspired by the squares of northern Italy. For a time, it was London's most fashionable address, but by 1670 it had fallen from favour and a market was set up there. The credit for turning London into a brick city lies with Charles II. In 1660, at the Restoration, Charles set up a new and brilliant court at the lost Palace of Whitehall that was on the site of the modern green-roofed Ministry of Defence. The aristocracy, who had largely left London during Oliver Cromwell's rule, returned and began to build lavish townhouses nearby. One of the first developments was St James's Square, constructed by Henry Jermyn, the first Earl of St Albans, hence Jermyn Street nearby. This square, and others, like Leicester Square, built in the 1670s, invented a new quarter of London. It was called the West End. King James's ambition to rebuild London in brick and stone got nowhere. If it had, the catastrophe of the Great Fire in 1666 would have been avoided. In 1667, an Act of Parliament was passed specifying how the city should be rebuilt. In 1707 and 1709, further acts were passed which invented a new type of building, the terraced house. A number of early terraces survive, like here in Lord North Street, Westminster. They formed the model for the future development of the metropolis. During the 18th century, the combination of the London Terrace and the London Square were to transform the land to the west of St James's Square and to the north of Piccadilly. The aristocratic landowners who held farmland in these parts cashed in and developed housing estates on them. Their names live on in the streets: Arlington, Berkeley, Cork and Albemarle. Bond Street was named after its original owner, Sir Thomas Bond. The whole area north of the house of Lord Burlington, Burlington House, was developed, including Savile Row, famous now for its tailors, as well as today being the headquarters for English heritage. But the most spectacular and valuable estate belonged to the Grosvenors and comprised 100 acres in what is today Mayfair. Grosvenor Square was built in the 1720s and 30s, Grosvenor Street soon after. This once insignificant piece of farmland near Westminster has made the present Duke of Westminster the richest man in Britain. In concentrating on the city and the West End, it's easy to forget another factor in London's development. Medieval villages surrounded the city and Westminster. Highgate, as well as places like Wimbledon and Putney, were all places that increasingly came to rely on the capital for their prosperity. In the 18th century, as London started to become one of the world's economic superpowers, rich merchants began to build their houses in and around these villages. A few survive, like Fenton House in Hampstead, now in the hands of the National Trust. During the 18th century, these villages like Clapham in South London grew, and new houses were built as they became little satellites to London and Westminster. These houses are on the north side of Clapham Common. And out on the Mile End Road to the east, a small group of houses remind us of the time when Mile End was a village. Spitalfields was once also a small village just outside the city, where silk workers and other craftsmen set up home. It wouldn't be long before these houses were devoured by the ravenous metropolis that London was becoming. For many hundreds of years previously, London had also sprawled south across London Bridge to Southwark. This is where the Tudor theatres had been, on the site of the New Globe today. Until Westminster Bridge was built in 1738, London Bridge was the only way of crossing the river. As it was closed at night, travellers often stayed in the many inns south of the river, like the surviving 17th century George Inn. The area became the red light district of the 17th and 18th centuries. Although London had grown more or less continuously from the 16th century, it grew from 1 million people in 1800 to 6.5 million in 1900, becoming the largest city on the planet. London's expansion in the 19th century seemed unstoppable. During the 1830s, the area between Westminster and Kensington began to be filled with new houses for the rich. One man who would make a fortune and whose name is still seen on building sites is Cubitt. It was Thomas Cubitt who transformed swampy land into the Belgravia estate, making the Grosvenor family very rich indeed. Cubitt also developed Grosvenor land in Pimlico, with its straight streets and squares of stuccoed houses. In the mid-19th century, the church still held large areas of land that it decided to develop too. Incredibly, the Bishop of London still owned Fulham, Acton, Ealing, Drayton, Finchley, Greenford, Hanwell, Hornsey, Rickmansworth, and most promising of all, Paddington. While the better off lived in the west and northwest, the East End was rapidly expanding to accommodate London's workers. It's sometimes forgotten that London's Industrial Revolution was larger than that in the north and was accompanied by the explosion of the Port of London and its docks. A huge population grew up working in the docks and in London's great manufacturing industry, textiles. Slum housing grew as landlords exploited the intense market for accommodation. These small houses on the Jesus Green estate in Bethnal Green are from the 1830s and have somehow survived later development. A whole house was beyond the dreams of most workers, and many East End houses were subdivided. In some cases, whole families lived in only a single room. None of this building was accompanied by proper sanitation. Thousands died in terrible epidemics of cholera, and in some areas, over 50% of children would die before they reached their 5th birthday. The discovery of a link between contaminated water and disease was to lead, eventually, to the building of the sewers in the embankment in 1865. The sewers disgorged their contents into reservoirs 11 miles to the east at Beckton and Crossness. The amazing pumping station at Abbey Mills was designed by Sir Joseph Basil Gett in a Byzantine style. By 1900, the newly formed London County Council was busy buying huge areas of slum housing, demolishing it, and constructing its own housing estates for workers. The Boundary Street estate in Shoreditch was one of the largest, covering 13 acres. But state intervention in the pattern of London's growth was the exception rather than the rule. London, on the whole, grew without central control or design. There are a small number of exceptions, and the earliest of these is the Prince Regent's sponsorship of Regent Street and Regent's Park. In 1811, in order to address concerns about London's higgledy-piggledy appearance, a competition was held to find a way of making a grand vista between a new development in Regent's Park and St James's. As a result, the royal architect John Nash laid out the great stuccoed terraces in Regent's Park and a new street, Regent Street. Regent Street was London's first piece of urban master planning. The first section at Langham Place turned on a specially designed church. As the road reached Piccadilly, it swerved east to avoid the still fashionable St James's Square. There, Piccadilly Circus was built. Regent Street, as we see it today, was actually rebuilt in the 1910s. Another factor that fundamentally altered the shape of London was the arrival of the railways. This meant that people could live further out and still work in the city or the West End. The arrival of the train would lead to yet more expansion. Areas like Acton, Willesden, Edgware, and here at Muswell Hill were connected by new suburban railway lines. Mass housing development followed in their wake. For the better off, new garden suburbs were about to be built alongside the new railways. Here at Bedford Park, the eminent Victorian architect Richard Norman Shaw helped create the first garden suburb in the 1870s. In 1888, the London County Council was formed, and with it came much greater control. In 1922, they built themselves new headquarters on the Thames, County Hall. This was to be the headquarters of London for the next 75 years. In 1894, a new Building Act was passed, restricting the height of buildings and controlling their surroundings. Out of this start, the planning system that we know today was finally established. But despite these developments, London continued to expand outwards. In the 1930s, new roads encouraged ribbon development, houses built either side of a main arterial road. The London suburbs doubled in size in the 1930s. New tube lines were extended outwards to meet the needs of these new suburbs. Uxbridge Station was built as the end of the Piccadilly line in 1933. War in 1939 brought a natural halt to house building, but it also triggered one of the most significant periods of change that London has known. Hitler's bombs did a great deal of damage, particularly in the city to commercial premises, but it also caused havoc to industry and the docks, and destroyed 3.5 million houses. But it was the response of the planners to the destruction of the war that really changed the face of London. Never before had such comprehensive redevelopment happened on such a large scale. Never before had planners had control rather than private enterprise. And never before had the promotion of a new style of building and planning been introduced so quickly. Housing estates, shopping centres, office blocks rose up all over London, ignoring centuries-old street patterns, ways of life and cherished views. The London Hilton Hotel was the first major building to break with the height regulations and was quickly followed by other structures like Centrepoint and the Telecom Tower. London now acquired its first high-rise buildings. Some new housing was high-rise too, springing out of densely packed streets with little regard for areas below. But the Trellick Tower in West London is now increasingly appreciated and is, in fact, a listed building. Other high-rise buildings, like here at Roehampton, were sometimes built in green areas of their own. Although we're coming to appreciate some of these developments today, the main problem with the post-war reconstruction was that it wasn't integrated into the historic grain of London. The Barbican may be a really nice place to live in or visit, but it's a blot on the part of London in which it sits. The massive commercial Canary Wharf development, built on derelict dockland away from the close-knit historic city, is widely considered to have been much more successful. But let's finish with one of London's largest private landlords, the Grosvenor Estates. In the 1970s, they worried about conservation and residential character, roads, infrastructure, in fact, every facet of activity, including low-cost housing for essential trades. They prepared a plan and put local authorities to shame. In many ways, it's thanks to these private landlords that so much of central London looks the way it does. For many centuries, private families have cared for and maintained these streets, preserving the character that their ancestors created when they first built them. The shape, style and pattern of London is thanks to people like these. They have made London the glorious place it is, and quite unlike any other city in the world.